Hey, I'm Jamie McKeever, the project lead for the Safety Tips project. I wanted to do a short video explaining a few things about the project because I've had a bunch of questions coming in asking us about particular points that I want to elaborate on and try and explain a few things about where we're going. At the time of filming this, we currently stand at 2/3 of our target. Something like 40 people have contributed, so thank you all very much, early contributors. You've really helped make sure that this has got some momentum behind it, and for your generous contributions. Our target for the base study is 3,500, so we're currently at about 2,000 and something. And the questions I've been asked really have been around sort of our expected ability to deliver on this project, so I'm going to talk about that. I've been talking about why we've chosen the based projects that we've got and why the first kind of experiments are so expensive. So I'll elaborate on that. And what some of the stretch experiments are that we want to do and why we want to go well past our 3,500 target if we can. If this is your first time hearing about the Safety Tips project, just a quick overview. What we are proposing to do is to run some scientific tests to try and understand the risks and issues around whether one should tip, as in add extra material to the tip of, the point of one's sword in HEMA. We've devised two basic tests. One of those is designed to test how much force is applied, particularly to a mask, and whether a safety tip added to it increases or decreases the chance of a sword pushing on a mask and potentially causing a concussion. And the other test is going to look at puncture risk. By striking a consistent medium ballistic gel, we'll be able to determine whether we are increasing or decreasing puncture risk by adding material to a sword tip as well. Different debates focus on one or the other risks, which is why we're testing both. And hopefully we'll be able to determine whether there's some safety tip which manages to effectively reduce both risks at once rather than choosing one versus the other. So on to the first question, why that 3,500 target for the first experiment, where we think each of our stretch experiments is only going to cost probably closer to 1,000. Well, essentially what we're charging for is time and materials for all these kinds of things, both kind of repeatable. Some of the materials are things that will be reusable, and some of the things are ones that we'll have to buy every time we do the experiment because they have limited reuse, like the ballistic gel, for instance. Well, the reason that first experiment is so expensive is that we need to set up the things that have that one-time use, that once they're there, we can then reuse again and again and again for each of the stretch experiments. The main two things for that, for the first experiment, we need both targets that have different levels of resistance, so we can understand how much force is being applied to the human inside the mask, essentially, and also to measure the force, we need a bunch of accelerometers. We've found the ones we need, we've tested that they work. We've got one right now that we've used for a pilot study, and we need more because they have limited battery life, and also we want to make sure that we've got accelerometers in multiple places, at least on the sword and the target, or rather the target under the mask, because that will allow us to determine the relationship between heavier hits and lighter hits, right, and be able to understand whether the risk kicks in at a certain point, at a certain threshold, or whether it's a risk which is there no matter what kind of strength behind the hit happens to be. It is perfectly possible that, for instance, the sword is more likely to skip off a mask from a stronger hit rather than a weaker hit. No one knows. The second experiment is actually the one that has the bulk of the costs. We have to do essentially a controlled drop onto ballistic gel. To do that, we need to have a rig that essentially can hold any sword securely, drop it from a platform at a particular height, have a completely straight drop, and have a fairly precise kind of this size target, probably. Fairly precise targeting, so that striking consistently in the middle of a target of that size. And that will allow us to be able to measure sort of how much puncture is happening, if at all, on that target, which is going to be kind of a cylinder of ballistic gel to save on ballistic gel costs. Additionally, making ballistic gel is quite difficult. It's easy to make something that looks basically a bit like ballistic gel. What's difficult is making sure that it is kind of essentially lab grade gel. That requires kind of controlled temperatures. That requires quite a careful production process. And again, we've tested it. We know how to do it. But to do it at a strict control, strict temperature control, again, we need to buy some specialist equipment to make it easier to sort of repeat that. A lot of this setup then reduces the time it's going to take us to run repeat experiments. So actually, if we get particularly far past, our goal, the more we do, the faster we're going to get on using these things, and the more kind of structures we're going to make into it. So actually, the cost per experiment goes exponentially down because so much of this is involved in creating the testing rigs in the first place. I now want to talk a bit about the base experiment versus the stretch goals, right? And our base experiment is going to take one sword. It's going to be a rapier. I'll explain why in a second. And probably 5 or 6 different tipping methods, give or take, right? We're going to do a bit of a survey to make sure that we've got tipping methods that are actually in use, not just the ones that are in use in the UK. But it's going to be at least plastic, probably 2 types of plastic, because we've got thermoplastic and we've got heat shrink end caps. For anyone who's used them, they're just a hard plastic. It comes ready made. Bullet casings, at least 1 kind of soft rubber tip, maybe 2, because I think there's a couple in circulation, at least in the UK. A leather tip, and of course untipped, so no tip at all. Some people have sent some suggestions through for other styles of tipping. As long as they are currently in use in HEMA, we're interested in testing them. So if you use something that I haven't listed there, please do contact us and let us know so we can consider putting it in. And it's going to again test that for both the concussion risk and the puncture risk with a rapier. Why rapier? Rapier is the one which is kind of least controversial in the hemisphere, whether you should tip it or not. Most people who do rapier tip their swords. In fact, almost everybody does. Only fairly recently have we seen rapiers with any kind of flared tip built in. And even with that flaring, the cross-section of even the flared rapier tips is probably a quarter of what you would see for an equivalently rolled or flared longsword. Using the same kind of built-in tipping method. So as a result, the pressure is much higher, and this puncture risk is way higher with a rapier than it is with other weapons. The only other weapon with kind of a smaller cross-section is probably small sword, but small swords are half as stiff, if not less, and less than half the weight as well of a rapier. So there's lots of other factors there that make it kind of less of a risk with small sword, but we don't really know, and we would hope to test that as well. As well as that, right, because everybody's already tipping their rapier, the conclusions that we come up with for this, if we get a clear answer for which tips are suitable, which tips are not suitable, it can be enacted, for a low cost around the world. The most expensive tips are costing less than £5 to do, right? So low cost, low effort. Again, retipping your sword is kind of a 10-15 minute job, and suddenly everybody's fencing safer. So we picked something that we think has immediate value to HEMA as it's actually practiced, because most people are already tipping their rapiers, and if people read our conclusions and agree with them based upon the evidence we presented, people will be able to very quickly, easily, cheaply fix their sword to whatever is the best method for doing it. So essentially, the highest benefit for the cost is going to come from that, because it will not be hard to enact across the world. Now let's look at some of the stretch experiments, right? So we've got that 3,500 target for that to get set up, and we want to do some stretch experiments if we blow past that target. Well, there are some obvious ones that we want to do, all of which have kind of different costs and different related activities to them, because many of them require us to have additional materials for the testing. The most obvious one is doing the same thing on other weapons, right? We're going to start with a rapier. As I said, I gave good reasons why, I hope. We have all the other swords we could need to do that. We've got sabers, we've got a side sword, we've got a long sword, we've got a small sword. So we could easily repeat the same experiment using a different weapon, messer, whatever we want to do. Probably will prioritize based upon which ones people are actively tipping right now. So we can kind of look at that. Or maybe we'll do long sword and small sword because those are the extreme ends of the spectrum. We haven't decided yet what the priority order for the stretch goals is, and actually, if you're interested in contributing to that, then one of the backer tiers does allow you to help us decide which order to do any stretch goals are we do if we do get to that. So that's the different weapons. We also think we could test by isolating certain properties of swords and test multiple swords of the same type using the same structure, right? And again, that could either be tipped or untipped depending on the recommendations from the first phase of the project. But to give an example, right, Regenier offers 3 levels of stiffness. So you can get 3 basic identical swords that differ only in their stiffness properties. How does that affect both of these risks? We can test that. We have, again, there are options where some suppliers have basically the same shaped swords with the same levels of flex. The difference between them being the weight. And they have kind of different tapering to them, so we'll be able to test the difference between doing the same striking speed, with a heavy sword versus a lighter sword, right? And see how that affects things. Some suppliers also have different built-in point types that they offer, right? They are essentially identical swords, but they might offer a flared tip, a roll tip, a rounded tip. How does that affect it? Again, that's the sort of thing that we can test. And all of those will require us to deal with the suppliers and get certain swords for that, right? We don't necessarily have these identical swords out, because the important thing with all of these is we're trying to isolate a property to test one at a time. That's how science works. And that will essentially allow us to kind of isolate these things and see the differences between them. There were some other things we could potentially do in that space that you might want to do as a side project with the same materials. For instance, we could test, people often say, oh, if you have a light sword, you swing faster. I'm not sure that's true. I don't think anyone's sure that's true. We'd also be able to test that. I think if we were doing the heavy, the test images, we'd be able to see whether that works with some of the other stretch goals we've got. Because one of the other ones we've considered is testing cutting force and see how that affects things. So the cutting force test is pretty much the same as test 1, the test is striking a mask. We have a striking target that moves equally well in any direction. And once again, you add an accelerometer to the sword, an accelerometer to the mask, or rather the stand that the mask is on, and you strike the mask. What happens, right? And you can see how much force is transferred to it by whatever criteria we want, right? That could be the weight of the sword, that could be the flex of the sword, from the things we've done before, or it could be just comparing, striking with a rapier versus striking with a longsword. These are all options. Which options we pursue will depend again on how much money we get. We also want to be able to test a bit more nuance to tipping. This will depend a little bit on the results of option 1, because if there is a clear leader with different options within it, we can then test which of those options is the best, best of breed, as it were. We can isolate some properties, assuming it's not proven to be an abysmal tip for all regards, but we can isolate some properties with different plastics. So we had planned to use thermoplastic, or maybe if we can get some cast plastic, that might be good too. Thermoplastic allows us to exactly determine the shape and thickness that we want to do while maintaining a consistent weight. So again, we can isolate just things about the shape of the tip, at least if it's a hard tip, or how wide it needs to be. Is it just a function of cross section? Is it just a function of the shape it is? We don't know, right? So we can do that too. And protective gear is another big one, particularly for the puncture test, right? And we're kind of already testing protective gear with the first test, but with the second test, the puncture test, a lot of people argue that there's no need to tip a sword because actually our jackets keep us safe. That would be something that we can test by essentially adding a protective layer over the ballistic gel. There could be anything from unprotected, thin layer of fabric. Does a t-shirt good enough? What does that even do anything? Don't know. What about foam and fabric? Does the puncture resistant fabric really make a difference? And how much of a difference does it have? And of course, all these layers can be layered together. That one I really hope we get to do because there's an awful lot of debate about whether we should be asking for 350 Newton or 800 Newton stuff in tournaments. No one really has an answer to that question. Obviously, enacting that one will be way more expensive because people might need to buy new jackets. I hope they don't. But that's something that we need to deal with if we have the information for it. What I'd really like to do for that one is to repeat it with broken swords as well as non-broken swords. So not just testing tip methods here, but testing actual sword breaks to see whether they're going to be going through these levels of protection and what level of mitigation each layer of protection has. That would require us having a bunch of real broken swords, which is fine because I have quite a few in my cupboard upstairs that I've been saving to fix at some point, but I never got around to, or to do something with. Using them for science seems like a perfectly reasonable option. And a bunch of other people have offered their broken swords to test. That's something that I really, really hope we manage to get to with the stretch goals. So hopefully that's given you a flavor for the kinds of stretch goals we have. We are kind of constantly evolving some of these things, and it is possible that we might add additional stretch goals if we go way past that, or if there are results and unexpected results in the first experiment that might change what we prioritize for this. Some of those can be done just with the equipment we've got and buying some new ballistic gel. Others require us to get sword samples, get protective gear samples, get different kind of styles of tipping. So they vary quite a bit in cost. Our rough estimate of 1,000 kind of spreads that across that, and what will actually happen when we know how much money we have, we'll cost these up fully and decide sort of what we can fit in. Because it might be there's a lower priority experiment which is cheaper, so we kind of slot it in with whatever funding we actually happen to have. Which brings me to my last, which I've been asked a couple of times by a few people, which is, am I confident that we can deliver? I'll start by saying yes. It's the short version. I am very confident, provided we get sufficient funding. And I'll start this by saying that HEMA does not have, shall we say, the best past experience with Kickstarter, especially for protective kit, that people often have back to Kickstarter and they've waited 2 years for some protective kit to happen and it never materialized. Well, I'm very confident that won't happen here, not least because we're not actually producing any protective kit, right? We don't have to produce a final product. There are no uncertain questions we've got to solve in terms of manufacturing processes for creating a product for you to use. What we're producing is some insight and some experiments. The team I pulled together was not random. So we bring together a bunch of different experience. And there are really kind of 4 aspects of delivery that I think each of us uniquely helps with. So first is making sure we actually stay on track with things like the Kickstarter, with things like responding to people, with our goals for when we do things. That's what Kelsey brings to the table. She's a project manager. She also helps on kind of content editing for our website, and for NHFC she keeps me on track with a bunch of stuff, and for this project it will absolutely be helping with that. Another important thing is making sure that we have robust results. Well, Alex, who's joined the team, he describes himself as a consultant scientist. He works in the scientific field. He understands the analysis results. He understands all this kind of stuff. So while I came up with the base experiments, he's already provided lots of tweaks to make sure that the results are robust. We know what stats we want to do. We know how to do them. I'm actually a data professional in my day job. So I'm going to be setting up some things to make sure that the stats analysis is as robust as possible and as smooth as possible, so that when we do new experiments, it's not onerous. We're able to just kind of dump the results in and process a useful data set. The accelerometer data is a bit messy, so that's why that needs to be happening. But I've already seen it, so I know how to do that. It's nice and straightforward. So analysis, experimental design will be good. Data analysis will be smooth, and we know how to do all the things we want to do there. We did a pilot study. I have mentioned this a couple of times. So we have tested both that the ballistic gel gets us meaningfully different results in tipping methods. It does, absolutely. We didn't have such a control drop on that because it was just kind of doing it by eye, which is why we need the rig to do it properly. But very visibly different results depending on tipping methods in terms of the height that punctures were happening. And likewise did a pilot with the first test to see that we could get good results out of the accelerometers, and again we could. So that's straightforward. So I'm confident the experiments will work. 100%. The pilot study has shown that they will work. Just we need the kit to make sure it's robust and that we're testing kind of all angles and controlling for variables. The next aspect is making sure that we communicate it well. And Mads has come along in their day job. They do audio and video stuff. That's also their degrees from. So the video I think is important because not everybody's going to want to read a scientific paper with kind of detailed stats analysis in it. And it'll be very useful for kind of getting the message out, making sure people know. They produced the other video that we've done, the intro video to the project. And as well as that, we want to get some written comms out that is neither the scientific study but not the video, written down. And again, Kelsey, copy editor, will help us make sure that that's nice and communicable and readable. And then the last one is making sure that these things can actually be related to HEMA as it's practiced. We're all HEMAists, so we all come in there to a certain extent. I think that's mostly what I bring to the table. I'm on the committee for LHFC, one of the larger clubs in the UK. More relevantly, I'm on the committee for the Wessex League. For those that don't know, Wessex League combined with Albion Cup makes up the 4 largest tournaments in the UK every year, right? And we have an outsized impact on HEMA in the UK because of that. Because if we mandate a certain tip, quite a lot of the HEMA competitors will then use that tip because, well, they want the tip to be accurate for Wessex League. But also, a lot of the things that we're thinking about here are based upon kind of the injuries I've seen anecdotally over the years and sort of what I've kind of come up with thoughts about the causes for them. They are really, these risks are real. They are really happening in tournaments. The problem is we don't understand the causes of them. We don't understand the solutions for them. So absolutely, I think in terms of our ability to do the experiments, our ability to make sure that we stay on track, our ability to communicate the results, and ability to apply the results, I think all of those bases are covered. So as I said, I am 100% confident with the funding we'll be able to deliver this and deliver this well and deliver this in a timely manner. And hopefully that's answered some of the major questions that people have been asking me and gives people a bit more confidence in terms of backing the Kickstarter. If you haven't seen it, I will link it in the comments to this video. You can donate money there. I'll also link to the original trailer video that gives a bit more detail about the projects and shows them in action, the pilot studies in action, so you can see what we're doing and see a bit more about what we're about. And if you have thoughts about tipping methods, please share them with us. If you have thoughts about stretch experiments you'd want to see, please share them with us. We are absolutely interested in hearing these kinds of things. And as I say, if you are back at the higher tier, you will have direct input into making sure that whichever stretch experiments we do are tailored to the risks that you're kind of experiencing in your areas as well. Thanks for watching, and I hope one of my upcoming videos will be saying how we've blown through our target and telling you which stretch experiments we are planning on doing.